many years of campaigning for the rights of women. So over to you, Taina.
Thank you so much. And it's such an honor to be here. I wanted to thank Nozizwe and Jeremy for inviting me. And it's always very hard to follow women like Griselda. I just want to honor her journey. And yes, she and so many other survivors around the world are the ones who help us, inspire us, move us to doing this work to end sex trafficking and prostitution. So for people who don't know, the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, it's one of the oldest international organizations that focuses by its name on ending trafficking in women and girls and their commercial sexual exploitation. And what makes us unique is that we are the first ones to have done so from gender-based violence and discrimination. So I was asked to answer 3 questions by Embrace Dignity. What is the equality model law, also known as the Nordic law or the abolitionist model? Why should South Africa enact this legal framework? And why do we think that South Africa and other governments should listen to survivors? And I think Griselda answered that question brilliantly. So I will walk with you toward, so the equality model in a nutshell. First question. In a nutshell, it is a national legal framework that has 4 prongs. First, it decriminalizes prostituted people who are overwhelmingly women and girls. Like I would say globally, it's 95% of people who are exploited in prostitution, who are prostituted, are women and girls, and the other percentages being boys and trans women and trans youth. So this is why it's a gender-based violence and discrimination issue. So no arrest, no incarceration for prostituted people. Secondly, the government would mandate or the government would have a mandate to offer prostituted people comprehensive services, including exit strategies, if they are willing and open and available emotionally and otherwise to leave the sex trade. Critical to the equality model is holding sex buyers accountable for the harm that they cause. As we will see, and as Griselda explained, sex buyers are not a harmless group of individuals. They cause immense harm, lifelong, pervasive psychological, physical, psychological harm. And then there is, more importantly, a call to educate society. One, that prostitution is gender-based violence and is inherently harmful, and that male demand for prostitution actually fuels the sex trade. And finally, that prostitution is a barrier to gender equality. Now, Sweden was the first country to enact such a model in 1999. 7 countries have followed suit, or I should say 7 jurisdictions, since Northern Ireland is a part of the UK and not a country. And these are the countries. And I see France in 2016, and Jonathan will talk to us more about what is happening in France. So why should South Africa enact the equality model? We should start with the South African Constitution, which I recommend everyone to read since it is a beautiful document. But it really, just a few points, is the concept of equality, the concept of equal protection, the concept of dignity and the right to have dignity respected and protected, the notion of freedom and security of persons, the notion of the right to be free from all forms of violence, either in the public or private sphere, and that is critically important, the right not to be tortured in any way, and the right not to be treated in a cruel, inhuman, or degrading way. So these concepts did not come out of South Africa. It started with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was adopted by member states right after World War II in 1948. And so what really is important, and you'll see throughout the laws that I will discuss, and also before any such concepts were codified in international instruments or law is the concept of inherent dignity and the concept of equality. What makes us human? What is it that gives us the right to live a life free of violence and dignity? And we know through the laws that governments have the obligation to ensure that all of its citizens, regardless of what status in which they were born, girl, boy, female, male, in poverty or not, that everyone has an inherent right to, and an inalienable right and a universal right to human rights. So while the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is not a legal instrument per se, what it did is that it launched a number of international covenants. And again, I'll just give a quick overview of the framework of why it is important from a legal basis, international and national legal basis. Why is it important for South Africa to enact the equality model? So the 1949 Convention for the Suppression of the Traffic in Persons and the Exploitation of the Prostitution of Others, also known as just the 1949 Convention, which South Africa ratified. As you will see, it goes back to the concept of dignity and worth, but what it also does is that it links trafficking to prostitution, sex trafficking in particular. Every country that has ratified or many countries, I should say, that have ratified the 1949 Convention often see themselves publicly as abolitionist countries. You will hear it from Argentina, for instance, that identifies as an abolitionist country because of its ratification of the 1949 Convention, as does France. And because South Africa has ratified it, it too should be deemed an abolitionist country. Then we have in 1980 what is known as the International Bill of Rights for Women, the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, known as CEDAW. And Article 6, a key article for our purposes, also mandates governments to take all appropriate measures, including legislation. So you'll also have cultural and other measures to suppress the traffic in women and the exploitation of prostitution in women. So again, here you see the links between trafficking and prostitution. And why? Because prostitution is just one element of the sex trade. And without that as a destination, there would be no sex trafficking. And again, you'll see the concepts of dignity and worth and equality between men and women. And then we have the 2000 Palermo Protocol, which gives us the internationally agreed upon definition of human trafficking. And what the protocol does is that it distinguishes the definition into act, means, and purpose. So the most important concept, I think, because the average person still believes that trafficking requires movement. If you ask a person, especially here in the United States where I am, people often think that it's someone who was chained from another country into a basement somewhere in the United States. So the fact that in the act, it's just the recruitment, harboring, inducing of someone, it does not require movement at all. The means of trafficking are very important because you will see that the means of trafficking can apply to pimps and other exploiters, right? So threat or use of force. What Griselda described is exactly the types of means that lead people to being exploited in prostitution or in labor as well, right? Because this definition applies to both labor and sexual exploitation and other forms of exploitation. Within the definition of trafficking in the Palermo Protocol, it talks about different forms of exploitation. So it's really important to remember that the exploitation of prostitution is one of the many purposes. There's also organ removal, slavery and slavery-like practices, and labor. Also key is that consent to exploitation is irrelevant. Very often we hear, as we do in many other conversations around violence against women and girls, that the concept of consent or agency or choice. When someone is being exploited, that consent is absolutely irrelevant. And also key although not in the definition, but under Article 9.5, is that governments must target the demand that fosters sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And then, of course, if you are a person under the age of 18, you are defined as a child, and therefore a government needs to show none of the means. So if you are under 18 and you find yourself in the sex trade, you are, by legal definition, both internationally and nationally, a sex trafficked person. When you turn 18, that legal status does not disappear, and neither does the trauma. Also, recently in 2020, we have the great benefit of the CEDAW Committee's General Recommendation number 38, which is a key tool to remind governments that forms of trafficking are very linked to sex and gender inequality, and also that there is a link between trafficking and the exploitation of prostitution. And again, and I think Griselda really said it brilliantly, is that there are structural bases and active constructions of sex-based discrimination that sustain the exploitation of prostitution. And interestingly enough is that the General Recommendation number 38 really links the desecration of women and girls in trafficking and sexual exploitation to the desecration of other forms of abuse that can lead to breaches of international peace and security. So specifically with respect to South Africa, probably people who are listening in are familiar with PACOTIP, critically important for South Africa in that it incorporates all of the structures and provisions of the Palermo Protocol. So it basically domesticates the UN Trafficking Protocol, and it refers to the Bill of Rights of your Constitution. And again, the concept of human dignity and equality and right to freedom. And it criminalizes all forms of human trafficking. So again, I know I talk a lot about trafficking, and very often people say, well, what's there, you have prostitution, or what some people call quote unquote sex work, which I will talk about in a little bit. And then you have trafficking on the other end, and never the two shall meet. It's important for people who can be intimidated by the whole concept of human trafficking to remember that trafficking is just a vehicle. So here I have the little train. It's a train through which traffickers bring their victims to an end destination. So in labor trafficking, that end destination can be agricultural settings or mines or restaurants. But when it comes to sex trafficking, that end destination is the sex trade. And the sex trade is a plethora of commercial sex establishments, including street prostitution, which Griselda talked about. I mean, she really gave us a good overview of the places in which she was exploited. And we shouldn't forget online, right? So street prostitution is visible. It's very often easier for direct service providers and certainly the government agencies and law enforcement to identify, if they so choose, street prostitution. It's a lot more difficult for governments to keep up with online exploitation. And as we have heard, since COVID-19, there has been an exponential increase of online sexual exploitation. And so why should South Africa listen to survivors? I don't know anyone who could listen to Griselda and hundreds of other survivors with whom we work, those who are leaders and about to be leaders, who they should move us all to recognize that addressing prostitution in particular is really an urgent matter of human rights. So we cannot talk about the system of prostitution without talking about colonialism and centuries of human enslavement, and also violence against women, right? Gender-based discrimination, and the fact that for millennia, girls have been seen as second-class citizens and not quite human. And I always like to quote a book by the prominent law professor Catherine McKinnon, whose title is Are Women Human? And this is a question that we ask ourselves every day, and we work toward making sure that our governments do recognize that we are full human beings. So briefly, we know that in the beginning of the 16th century, the Netherlands invades Cape Town. And I chose Cape Town particularly because that is where Embrace Dignity is situated. And with them, as they did all over the world when the European settlers invaded the Americas and across Africa, West Africa in particular, that they brought with them the concept of prostitution, the system of prostitution. And it remains today a very strong expression of colonialism, and it is steeped in race. I don't know if some of you picked up how Griselda was mentioning the whole concept of race-based advertisements of women in prostitution, and we know that women are sold and marketed based on negative stereotypes steeped in their ethnicity or race. And then, of course, there's the famous case of Sarah Baartman, who was trafficked and prostituted and auctioned in the very fancy salons and in the circuses of Paris and London. So again, just to repeat, and this is Griselda presenting before the General Assembly at the United Nations. People are still talking about her very powerful statement. The vulnerabilities that are key, abuse of vulnerability and abuse of power, two means that lead to trafficking and that the Palermo Protocol addresses. We know from listening to survivors, from hearing their voices, that very often they share childhood sexual abuse histories of displacement, harmful cultural practices, and of course, poverty, and the belonging to marginalized group. And debt bondage is also very important because people often don't understand. If you talk to people who want to maintain systems of prostitution, who call it work, and what sometimes they will tell you, well, these women, they have debt to repay, or they owe money, or they have to feed their families. That is a concept of debt bondage, very, very difficult to escape, and is a human rights violation. So I wanted to go to the term quote unquote sex work, since it is a term that is very popular in South Africa and now in the United States increasingly so. We see it everywhere. 5 years ago, Rare was the newspaper who used it as a euphemism for prostitution, and now it is omnipresent. It is a term that was invented by the sex trade itself and its supporters to mainstream and normalize prostitution. But we know, and the law tells us, and certainly the Declaration of Human Rights tells us as well, that it cannot be sex or work. It is a violation of human dignity. It's a violation of equality. And it is a term that I don't know how many of you have had the opportunity to read Caste by the American author Isabel Wilkerson, that talks about the caste systems, not just in the United States, but in India and elsewhere. And she talks about shape-shifting, how difficult it is to constantly battle. She talks mostly in terms of racial issues, right? Of Black people as being a subordinate caste, seen by the dominant caste in this country, in the United States, Caucasian people. But she talks about shape-shifting and how the powers that be keep numbing us to exploitation or discrimination or inequality by using different terms or bringing in different narratives. And reading that struck me that the term sex work is exactly that. It is not any different than what the Dutch settlers did in the 16th century. Today, in the 21st century, we are seeing this push to normalize something that is inherently destructive to both the individuals who are exploited in the sex trade and to society at large. So what are the solutions for South Africa? Again, not only do we have to make the links between sex trafficking and prostitution, but also between sex trafficking and the demand for prostitution. So I had already mentioned Article 9.5. This is an obligation of any state that has ratified the Palermo Protocol. And as an advocate, I would say that that the states who do not have the equality model are states that are not abiding by their obligations under the Palermo Protocol, under these ratified conventions. And so it's key for, and the measures are not just legislative, as I had mentioned, right? They're educational and cultural and administrative. And again, Jonathan will tell us more about the concrete examples of why it's important to focus on the demand for prostitution and also their successes. Now, when you have UN agencies such as the International Labor Organization estimate the number, the profits from sex trafficking, and it's a very, very narrow estimate, right? A very modest estimate of 99 billion profits, what they call illicit profits from sex trafficking. And because the ILO, quite unfortunately, seems to recognize prostitution as a form of work, obviously that 99 billion does not capture all of the money that is made from the sex trade. But one thing that no one ever says is, where does this money come from? And every single dollar of that 99 billion comes from the dollars of the men who purchase sexual acts. And so if we target the demand, then we shrink the business, the multi-billion-dollar global sex trade. So the challenges, as we know, we work in South Africa with just extraordinary grassroots advocates, and they work with legislators, and we have to broaden our field. Obviously, the abolitionist movement is a small, I'd like to say powerful, but we're a small group, and so it's so important to we need to keep raising awareness. Obviously, working with men and boys is key. Legal advocacy, this is what we do every day. What we should do increasingly, which we haven't done so yet as a global movement, is really ask the medical community and institutions of research to address to document the harms of prostitution on individuals. We have very limited information on the not so much on the psychological harm, because there are some reports on that, but just the medical issues. I remember speaking with an obstetrician gynecologist who works with women in prostitution, and I asked her, like, what is it that they complain most about? What are the ailments that you see? Because we think about STIs, sexually transmitted infections or gynecological issues or things of the sort. And she said they complain about pain. They have pain everywhere. They have plantar fasciitis from standing on heels for too long. I can't put a stethoscope on their chest because of the weight of men on their chest. Their thoracic cages are collapsed. They have their organs are failing because of undetected diseases, et cetera. And we do not have enough information about that. And I really believe that when the World Health Organization, when our Centers for Disease Controls and National Institutes of Health actually look at the immense harm that serial sexual invasion that is unwanted and paid for happens to individuals, then we, like smoking, we will recognize that prostitution is extremely harmful and a public health crisis. And with that, I wanted to thank you, but also give immense thanks to Embrace Dignity for their courage and their vision and their determination to ensure that South Africa follows the obligations that they have signed up to, both at the international level and the national level. And thank you.